Have you ever imagined what it would be like to believe with all your heart that there was no way out of your life? That the weight of past mistakes was so great that no hope could reach you? In the dusty heart of the Old West, amidst dirt streets, noisy saloons, and dusk duels, lived a cowboy named Elias. To many, he was just another tough gunslinger, marked by violence and bad choices. But inside him lay something no one saw, a weary, wounded soul, believing there was no salvation. Elias carried the label of a dangerous man, but what tormented him most were not the bullets he had faced, but the silent ghosts that haunted him every night. The solitude of the Wild West seemed to further burden his guilt. The cold, early mornings, the silence punctuated by the sound of the wind, and the glasses of whiskey that never brought relief were his constant companions. Perhaps you felt something similar, as if you were lost in a directionless desert. Have you ever been there? Elijah believed God had already given up on him, that redemption was a distant privilege reserved only for others. But little did he know that Jesus still had a surprising plan to change his entire story. Imagine the scene: a man sitting alone in the darkness of a stable, holding his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the ground while a mixture of anger and regret consumes his heart. The world around him continued to spin. Cowboys gathered in bars, horses trotted past. But for Elias, none of it made sense anymore. He believed his life was already marked by its inevitable end, and it is precisely here that the unexpected begins to happen. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you. Elias's story isn't just about a Wild West cowboy. It's about all of us who at some point in our lives believe there's no forgiveness, that it's too late to start over. And perhaps like him, you've also asked yourself, does God still care about me? Is there still a purpose for my life? These questions echoed in Elias's heart, like gunshots fired in the silence of the night. People looked at him and saw only a man hardened by time, but something greater was about to happen. On the dusty roads of Santa Helena, that small town forgotten on the map, Elias's destiny was about to intersect with a message that would change his path forever. With each step, without realizing it, he was getting closer to an encounter that would change everything. The most curious thing is that the transformation didn't begin with a great visible miracle, but with a simple word, spoken in the right place and at the right time. A word capable of breaking invisible chains, of igniting a flame he thought was extinguished. Have you ever felt as if a phrase or a gesture could pierce your heart, as if made just for you? Well, that's exactly what happened to Elijah. And this is where our story begins to gain momentum. Because amidst all the harshness of the Old West, amid gunslingers and duels, faith found a place to flourish in the most unlikely of hearts. Elijah didn't know it yet, but the life he believed lost was about to be redeemed. And what follows will show that when Jesus decides to act, no past is strong enough to impede the future he has already prepared. And perhaps as you listen to Elijah's story, something inside you is also being touched. Every person who passes by here carries a memory, a pain, or even a victory that can inspire someone on the other side of the screen. Therefore, I invite you to share in the comments what this story has already awakened in your heart. It could be a memory, a reflection, or even a feeling that has surfaced. Your voice matters, and when you record your experience, it not only enriches this space, but may be exactly the words someone else needed to read today. It's as if all of us together are building a conversation circle in the middle of this dusty Wild West road. And since we're walking side by side in this narrative, your gesture of liking this video also carries enormous weight. It seems simple, but each like shows that this message resonated with you, that it found a place in your heart. It's this show of support that allows more people to be reached, allowing Elias's story and so many other moving stories to resonate further than we could ever imagine. And if you want to continue traveling with me through these stories of the Old West, full of emotion, faith, and transformation, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss any new chapters we'll share together. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. It's a cycle of reciprocity. The more you get involved, the further we can spread these heartwarming messages. Now come back with me to the scene of Elijah, still alone amidst the dust of St. Helena, without imagining that the next step of his journey would be the most decisive of all. Santa Helena was one of those. Towns forgotten on maps, lost among endless prairies and surrounded by mountains that seemed to silently watch over everything. The sun burned mercilessly during the day, and at night the cold cut like a blade. The streets were dirt, always covered in dust that clung to the skin and eyes. The lamplit saloons were the heart of the place, where weary cowboys sought refuge in glasses of cheap whiskey and endless games of cards. There, deals were closed, arguments were held, and, often, life or death were decided in the blink of an eye. It was in this harsh, wild, and risk-filled setting that Elias built his reputation. The Wild West wasn't just a physical space, it was also a mindset. Every man carried within him the certainty that he needed to be ready to fight for his own survival at any moment. There were no laws strong enough to curb violence, and justice often came down to the quickest, trigger-happy shooter. Life, no matter how precious, could be cut short by a simple, sidelong glance. And in this hostile environment, every choice carried weight, every decision shaped destiny. Elias knew this better than anyone, having seen friends fall before him and having felt the guilt of bearing the consequences of his own thoughtless actions. But there was something no one noticed. Behind that cold face and hardened eyes, Elias was a man who, deep down, longed for peace. He had learned to hide this desire, as if it were a weakness. In that world, admitting the need for something greater was almost an invitation to defeat. And yet, in the silence of his mind, he wondered if life was all about duels, drinking, and solitude. The hidden truth was that his soul cried out for something that weapons could not give him. The routine in Santa Helena always seemed the same voices in the bar, the same tall tales told by gunmen seeking recognition, the same suspicious glances between men ready to draw their weapons. Time there seemed to move in circles, as if the town were trapped in an endless cycle of survival. However, behind the scenes of this life marked by repetition, small signs began to emerge, as if something larger was stirring in the invisible. Elias, without realizing it, was already being led on a journey of transformation that would completely change the way he saw himself and the world around him. The impact of the environment on him was immense. The vast prairies constantly reminded him of how small he was in the face of the vastness. The sound of the wind blowing through the creaking wooden doors, the clopping of horses echoing through the streets. All of this reinforced the feeling that his story could be lost at any moment. But at the same time, that arid landscape held a silent promise, that even in the driest place, something new can blossom. It was as if every detail around him was preparing the ground for an unexpected revelation. Elias walked the streets of Santa Helena, carrying not only the weight of the revolver at his waist, but also the invisible burden of his own conscience. How many times had he thought about leaving everything behind and starting over? How many times had he believed that transformation was impossible, that the past had condemned him once and for all? The curious thing is that the answer to these questions lay not in duels, nor in letters, much less in bottles of whiskey. It lay in something he couldn't yet see, but which was getting closer every day. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what was at stake was not just the story of a cowboy, but the journey of a man who needed to understand the true meaning of his decisions. What seemed like just another life marked by mistakes actually hid a hidden truth about to be revealed. And when that revelation came, the impact would be so great that nothing in Santa Helena would remain the same. Elias was known by everyone in Santa Helena. When someone mentioned his name aloud, it was common to see glances discreetly cross the room, some with fear, others with respect, and many filled with suspicion. He had a reputation as a tough man, the kind of cowboy who didn't take any nonsense lying down and solved any problem with his own hands or with the weight of the revolver at his waist. With each duel he won, with each fight he emerged unscathed. His reputation grew like a shadow over the town. But what met the eye was nothing more than a facade, armor forged by years of violence, alcohol, and choices that left scars not only on his body, but especially on his soul. The hidden truth was that Elias could no longer bear the life he was leading. Behind the courageous gestures and cold exterior lay a deeply broken heart. He knew the feeling of emptiness after a full night in the saloon, surrounded by noise and smoke, and yet in the silence of the room, he was overcome by a crushing loneliness. The bitter taste of whiskey no longer brought him solace, only reminded him of all he had lost. Friends gone too. Soon love's destroyed by his own inability to care for what mattered, and an honor that seemed to crumble a little more with each wrong decision. It was this internal conflict that made his story so powerful, because deep down, Elias was no different from many who believe their entire lives are already written and there's no way to start over. His mindset was marked by a kind of invisible condemnation. I was born to live this way, and this is how I will die. But the curious thing is that, even as he repeated these words to himself, something inside him insisted on whispering otherwise, as if a small spark of hope refused to be extinguished. This clash between who Elias appeared to be and who he truly was shaped his days in Santa Helena. When he crossed the street with his worn hat and his gaze fixed on the horizon, many believed they were in the presence of an invincible man. But behind the scenes, the reality was different. Sleepless nights, heavy thoughts, and a restlessness that gave no respite. He himself couldn't explain where this feeling came from. He only knew he carried a burden greater than he could bear. Elias was aware that his decisions had led him to this point. With each fight, each thoughtless choice, he felt like he was building a wall between himself and any possibility of redemption. He believed it was too late for any transformation, that the scars of the past were etched in stone. But at the same time, there were days when, gazing up at the starry, prairie sky, he wondered if he was truly alone on this journey. Was there someone watching from afar, someone capable of seeing beyond his flaws? It's at this point that the story begins to take on depth, because, despite the harshness that surrounded him, Elijah carried within him a heart that, even wounded, was still capable of feeling. And this hidden sensitivity was like a half-open door, ready to receive something he didn't yet understand, but which was already silently calling to him. The impact of this detail is immense, because it shows that not even the most hardened are completely closed to change. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what Elias was experiencing was more than a fight against external enemies. It was an internal battle against himself. His greatest wars didn't take place on the dusty streets of Santa Helena, but within his own mind. It was there that the most difficult duel took place, between the guilt that imprisoned him and the hope that insisted on emerging. This invisible confrontation is what reveals who we truly are, and in Elias's case, it showed that behind the gunslinger was a man crying out, albeit silently, for a new chance. Elias's past was like a shadow that never left. Wherever he went in Santa Helena, he seemed to carry the weight of every bad decision, every fight that left a trail of pain, every debt that kept him tied to unscrupulous men. In the saloons, many still remembered the troubles he'd gotten into, when drink took over and anger spoke louder than reason. For some, they were stories of a strong, feared, and ruthless man. For him, they were bitter memories, invisible scars that corroded his soul night after night. The hidden truth is that Elias felt trapped within a cycle of his own making, a cycle of destruction that seemed impossible to break. There were nights when he lay down, exhausted as he was, unable to sleep. The voices of the past echoed in his mind like a constant judgment. They were the faces of those he had hurt, the broken promises, the bonds torn apart by his inability to control his impulses. He tried to chase these thoughts away with alcohol, but the effect was short-lived. As soon as the silence of dawn settled in, reality returned even more powerfully, as if there to remind him there was no escape. Elijah believed with all his might that God had already given up on him. This belief cruelly shaped his mindset. With each passing day, he became convinced he was condemned to live without redemption, as if heaven were a place reserved only for others, never for someone like him. It was like carrying an invisible sentence, a label he accepted without resistance. And yet, deep in his heart, a question kept resurfacing. Is there truly no forgiveness for me? This doubt, however small, was enough to keep him conflicted. The impact of this guilt was not only felt in his soul, but also in his actions. Elias began to become even more withdrawn, avoiding deep conversations, only laughing in forced ways, and distancing himself from the few people who tried to get close. It was as if he had decided to live only on the surface, without allowing anyone to access the depths of his true pain. And it is precisely at this point that we realize the magnitude of the battle he was waging, because it wasn't against the enemies who stood before him, but against his own conviction that there was no way out. Elias knew that every debt he accumulated, every mistake he made, every thoughtless decision was another brick in the wall separating him from what he silently desired most, a new chance. He didn't tell anyone, but deep down, he recognized how much he dreamed of a different life. Yet at the same time, a relentless voice reminded him that it was impossible. After all, how could he believe in transformation when everything around him seemed to prove otherwise? Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what was at stake was not just the story of a cowboy marked by mistakes, but the portrait of a journey many of us also face. The difference between what we show the world and what we carry secretly can be devastating. And it is in this silent space that guilt takes root, sapping our strength and preventing any new beginning. The great revelation is that Elijah, even believing himself forgotten by God, had not yet realized that his story was far from over. That day began like so many others in Santa Helena, with the sun beating down on the city and a heavy air of suspicion hanging over every corner. But for Elias, nothing would ever be the same. He entered the saloon with a firm step, his gaze heavy and his heart racing. The fame that preceded him brooked no hesitation. All it took was a sidelong glance and a few sharp words for the challenge to be issued. There was no turning back. The duel was set, and everyone knew that in the Wild West, such decisions were never second-guessed. It was life or death. The crowd gathered outside, as always, eager for the cruel spectacle that fueled the city's reputation. The silence before the shot seemed to swallow everything around. Elias, his hand firmly on the revolver's grip, felt the weight not only of the weapon, but of his entire history. When the dry crack of the first shot cut through the air, dust rose and screams echoed. Elias fell, feeling the impact of the bullet pierce his body, as if, along with the blood, all his strength and the little hope he had left drained away. There on the dusty ground, his vision blurred and the metallic taste on his palate, he believed his journey had come to an end. Each second felt like an eternity, and his mind began to project images of everything he had experienced. He remembered the lonely nights, the unpaid debts, the thoughtless choices. He remembered the looks of contempt, the lost friends, the invisible scars he carried. And amidst this flood of memories, a cruel certainty imposed itself. Death would be the only way out. There was no possible transformation for someone so stained by the past. The crowd around him murmured, some curiously, others indifferently. To many, Elijah was just another gunfighter who had met his fate. But inside him, the battle ran much deeper. Lying on the cold earth, he felt not only the physical pain, but the weight of his own conscience crushing every fiber of his soul. It was as if all the voices condemning him echoed together, saying, "Here ends your story." This was the hidden truth he believed, that God had already given up on him, and that there was nothing more to hope for. But the curious thing is that in moments like these, when life seems to slip through our fingers, something unexpected often happens. Elias didn't know if it was the result of desperation or a belated revelation, but for the first time in years, he felt the urge to cry out for something greater than himself. There were no more disguises, no more masks. All that remained was a wounded, broken man, completely exposed to his own fragility. That moment was the turning point, because even though he believed it was over, a small spark still glowed within him, as if to say, "It's not over yet." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely at the limit when all seems lost that many stories change direction. The impact of despair reveals who we truly are, and in Elias's case, it brought to the surface a silent cry for redemption. This backstage of the soul, where no one else has access, is the place where invisible decisions shape visible destinies. And it was there, amidst the pain and blood, that something new began to move in his life. The heavy silence that had gripped Elias's mind after the duel was unexpectedly broken a few days later. Santa Helena, accustomed to its cycles of violence and arid routine, received a visit from a man unlike any who had ever passed through. He wore no weapons at his waist, nor did he carry the posture of a gunslinger. His presence didn't intimidate with brute force, but it drew attention with the serenity in his gaze, and the firm, compassionate tone of his voice. He was a traveling preacher, the kind who traveled from town to town, bringing not just words, but also hope. That morning, the town square, usually filled with brisk negotiations, heated discussions, and suspicious glances, became the stage for something unusual. Curious residents gathered around the man who held the Bible before them, speaking simply and directly, as if opening his heart without fear. Elias, still recovering from his injuries and carrying within him the memory of how close he had come to death, stood in the shadow of an alley, not daring to approach. He watched from afar, trying to understand why those words, which seemed so far from his reality, managed to penetrate his resistance. The preacher spoke of a God who never gave up on people, of a hidden truth many ignored. No matter how low someone had fallen, there was still a greater plan. Each sentence seemed to touch on old wounds, as if this unknown man were describing Elijah's own life in front of everyone. The crowd listened in silence, some curious, others skeptical, but for Elijah each word had a profound impact. He tried to resist, telling himself there was no turning back, that his decisions had condemned him. But then he heard the phrase that broke his last barrier: "I still have a plan for you." Those words echoed like thunder in his mind. He looked around, almost believing the preacher was speaking directly to him, despite being hidden in the crowd. It was as if, for the first time, someone saw beyond the image of the tough gunslinger, beyond his accumulated mistakes, beyond the burden of guilt he carried. Elias felt a lump tighten in his throat, and without realizing it, tears began to threaten to spill over. That statement seemed impossible to ignore. If there was still a plan, then perhaps he wasn't doomed to the end he believed was inevitable. From that moment on, something began to move within him. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but a crack that opened in a hardened heart. He still struggled with his own mindset, with the shadows of a lifetime built on violence and wrong choices. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed a revelation capable of changing everything. The contrast between the man who had fallen in the duel and the Elias who now listened in silence showed how much one decision could alter the course of an entire journey. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened there wasn't just a public speech. It was the encounter between a broken man and a promise of redemption. The impact of these words wasn't just what was said, but what they provoked within Elias, a seed of hope planted in arid soil. And when a truth like this finds space, no matter how small, the consequences can be far greater than imagined. Elias left that square as if he'd been struck by an invisible blow. The preacher's words wouldn't leave him alone. "I still have a plan for you," echoed in his mind like a hammer beating relentlessly. He tried to convince himself it was nothing more than rhetoric, a generic speech that could fit anyone. But deep down he knew there was something different there, something that directly touched the wounds he so zealously concealed. And precisely for this reason, the more he tried to push that memory away, the more it grew within him like an insistent flame. That night, lying in his simple bed, staring at the ceiling stained with lamp smoke, Elias began a silent battle. The pride that had always accompanied him spoke loudly. "You don't need this. You don't need pretty words to fix what's already lost." But another, softer voice questioned, "What if it's true? What if there really is a plan greater than the sum of your mistakes?" This struggle consumed him, transforming his early mornings into long, seemingly endless internal dialogues. The problem was that the weight of guilt was too real to ignore. He remembered every face scarred by his decisions, every debt left behind, every life he had negatively impacted. How could he believe in forgiveness when his history was so tainted? Elias revolted at the idea, muttering to himself, "Can God really forgive someone like me?" This question was like a thorn stuck in his mind, causing pain while revealing that deep down he longed for a different answer. It was curious to see how the mentality that had sustained him until then began to crumble. The man who prided himself on his toughness, who had built an image of invincibility, now found himself faced with a disconcerting fragility. Pride told him to move on, to keep a cool face and to give no room for feelings. But regret loomed like an inevitable shadow, reminding him that behind the facade lay a broken heart crying out for relief. This duality tore him apart. Elias began to withdraw even further from people. In the saloon he remained silent, refusing to engage in conversation, as if carrying a secret impossible to reveal. In solitude, he delved into memories he couldn't erase, but which now took on new weight, because for the first time he not only regretted what he had done, but wondered if there might be a path to transformation. It was as if the preacher's words had lit a beacon, showing that beyond the darkness, there still lay an unknown path. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because Elijah's inner struggle wasn't just about the past, but about the decision he would have to make from then on. Pride and regret can't inhabit the same space for long. At some point, one must choose which voice to follow. This conflict exposes the inner workings of the human soul, where unexpected revelations occur. It is on this shaky ground that true change begins, because each decision at this level has the power to redefine an entire journey. That night, the silence of Santa Helena seemed even more profound. The streets were already empty, and the wind blew, stirring up dust and making the barely closed doors creak. Elias walked alone, carrying within him a whirlwind of thoughts that gave him no rest. Each step seemed to weigh tons, as if his boots were attached not to the ground, but to the memories that haunted him. He didn't go to the saloon, didn't seek company. Instead, he entered the old, abandoned stable on the edge of town, a forgotten place used only for storing tools and hay scraps. There, surrounded by the smell of aged wood and the loneliness he knew so well, he finally broke down. Elias knelt on the hard ground, and what seemed impossible for that proud cowboy happened. Tears began to fall uncontrollably. The pain accumulated over years came to the surface, along with the anger, guilt, and the feeling of emptiness that had never left him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't try to hide behind his tough guy image, didn't need to maintain the mask of coldness that shielded him from the world. He was alone before God, and that was exactly how he needed to be. The words that came from his mouth were filled with pain, but also with a sincerity he had never known before. He cried out for mercy, confessed his disbelief and anger, but also admitted that he no longer had the strength to continue like this. Through his tears, his prayer was simple, almost a whisper. If there is still a plan for me, if there is still any hope, show it to me. I don't know how to change, but I no longer want to be a slave to what I was. This surrender, made in a forgotten stable, carried more weight than any public duel. What Elijah didn't realize was that this kneeling gesture wasn't a sign of weakness, but of transformation. Here was a broken man, yes, but also willing to let go of the pride that held him captive. This moment, hidden from the eyes of the city, revealed the backstage of his soul, where great battles were fought and won. The hidden truth is that no one else needed to see for something great to happen. It was in the silence of that stable that a new journey began to take shape. And as tears wet the dirt floor, Elias felt something that didn't come from himself. A gentle, small but real peace that contrasted with all the weight he carried. He still had scars, he still had to face difficult memories, but for the first time, he saw the possibility of a new beginning. This experience was the answer to the question that had tormented him so much: can God forgive someone like me? And the feeling that gripped his heart was clearer than ever. Yes, there is forgiveness, and there is a future. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because Elijah's decision shows how choices made in the secret of the soul have a visible impact on the course of an entire life. Surrender, when sincere, doesn't depend on audiences or applause, but on the courage to face oneself. It's in this place of vulnerability that revelations happen, and where mindsets truly begin to shift. What seems like mere tears and pain can actually be the beginning of a transformation beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. After that night in the stable, something in Elias began to change in a way no one in town could have imagined. It wasn't a sudden transformation, as if life had become perfect overnight, but rather a silent, profound shift that began in the shadows of his mind and heart. The man who had previously sought refuge in the saloon and in bottles, trying to drown guilt and memories, now began to look at those choices with new eyes. Alcohol, which had always been a companion in his escape, no longer held the same power. He felt he no longer needed to numb himself, because within him a new peace was beginning to emerge, a sense that the journey was not doomed, but rewritten. People in Santa Helena first noticed the absence of old habits. Elias was no longer seen getting involved in fights, no longer standing up to any provocation, and little by little he stopped being a regular at the noisy tables. At first, many laughed it off, thinking it was just a phase, a side effect of the wound from his last duel. But time showed that something was different. That hardened cowboy, once known for his coolness with the trigger, now walked with a more serene look, carrying a posture that revealed a different mentality. The impact on the town was clear. As even the most skeptical began to wonder what was happening to him, Elias no longer kept the revelations he had experienced to himself. Little by little, he began to help those facing similar battles. He met young people seeking a way out in violence and told them the hidden truth he had discovered, that strength lay not in the fear they could impose, but in the courage to face one's own mistakes and start anew. He visited families in debt, people he himself had harmed in the past, and offered support without expecting anything in return. It was as if each act of kindness was a way of writing a new page in his story, a page that erased the old scars without denying their existence. This transformation, though silent, spread like wildfire. The feared gunslinger came to be remembered as a man restored by faith. There were still those who viewed him with suspicion, of course, because it's not easy to believe that someone so marked by violence could change. But his consistent actions, firm decisions, and sincerity in every gesture spoke louder than any doubt. Elias had understood that his life didn't need to be defined by what he did, but by what he chose to become. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because true transformation isn't measured solely by external change, but by the internal impact that sustains each step. Elijah discovered that abandoning addictions and old habits was just the beginning. What mattered most was the heart that finally found peace, the weight he no longer carried, and the freedom of no longer living imprisoned by old guilt. This journey shows how seemingly small choices can completely alter the course of a life. The man who once believed his destiny was to die alone in despair now became an example that no one is beyond the reach of grace. If even Elijah, a cowboy lost in the Wild West, found redemption, so can you. This sentence is not only a beautiful conclusion, but a powerful reminder that no journey is irreversible. No mistake is definitive, and no life is so far gone that it cannot be transformed. His story shows that no matter how marked we are by wrong decisions, there is always the possibility of writing a new page. And the curious thing is that this possibility arises not when everything seems favorable, but precisely in the shadows of pain, when the heart is forced to face its hidden truth. It was at this point that Elijah knelt in a forgotten stable and decided that he would no longer be a slave to the past, but the protagonist of a revelation that would completely change his mindset. Elijah's transformation teaches us that the most profound impact comes not only when others begin to see us differently, but when we choose to see ourselves with new eyes. The man who once carried the weight of guilt now discovered the lightness of hope. And this doesn't mean the scars have disappeared, but rather that they have ceased to be open wounds and become marks of a restored history. This journey has much to say to us because each of us also faces internal battles, each of us intimately familiar with the voice of pride and the voice of regret vying for space within our souls. What makes all the difference is realizing there's a way back, even when we believe we're completely lost. Elijah discovered it wasn't the end when he thought everything was over. On the contrary, it was there that a new chapter began, guided by different decisions and sustained by a faith that rebuilt him from within. This is the kind of revelation that changes not only a man's destiny, but also the impact he has on everyone around him. That's why his life, once marked by fear and violence, came to be remembered as an example of transformation and courage. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what's at stake isn't just a cowboy story, but the reminder that each of us can rise from our own rubble and choose to walk towards something greater. Hope isn't a distant idea, but an accessible reality for those who decide to let go of pride and allow change to begin in the most unlikely place, within their own hearts. This is the hidden truth we so often try to ignore, but which, when embraced, has the power to redefine our entire journey. If you've made it this far with me, it's because this message spoke directly to your heart. And look, this makes me incredibly happy, because it shows that it wasn't just Elias's story, but a piece of your own journey that revealed itself on this path of transformation and hope. So leave a like, not just as a quick gesture, but as a sign that this connection resonated with you and that these words had a real impact on your life. And if they did, subscribe to the channel. That way you can continue walking alongside me in these inspiring and empowering stories, and also help this message reach more people who need to hear something like this. So I know you stayed until the end. Write in the comments, "This message was for me." It will be amazing to see how many of us are on this journey together. And if you want to continue now, there's another story right here that will make you emotional. Click and continue with me there.